Wedge Issues is brought to you by wispolitics.com, a place where political insiders go for news, opinion, and campaign information. Once again, that's wispolitics.com.
As Wisconsin Republicans fight to hold on to their majority in the state Senate, and Democrats hope to close the gap or even flip it in their favor, both parties are paying attention to the state's 17th Senate district in southwestern Wisconsin. I'm Jessie Opoyan, and this is Wedge Issues, a Cap Times podcast about the 2018 elections in Wisconsin. A few weeks ago, my colleague Katelyn Ferral went on a bus trip in the 17th district, highlighting local roads issues in the area. On the bus was Republican State Senator Howard Marklein, who currently represents the area, and his Democratic challenger, Kriss Marion. Katelyn joined me this week for a conversation about the role that transportation issues might play in this year's election. We are inching ever closer to Election Day, and this week, my colleague Katelyn Ferral is joining me to talk about a little road trip that she took that highlighted one of the key state legislative races and also one of the key issues in a lot of campaigns this year, transportation.
Yep. Hey.
So it's been a few weeks, but early last month in September, you went to Senate District 17, which is not far from Madison, where we're recording now, but a little different in its dynamics. What were you there for?
Sure. So I was there for what was called a Rough Road Tour, which is one of a series of PR local events put on by the Transportation Development Association, which is a group that has advocated for increases in revenue to fund and maintain state highways and roads, and local roads as well. And so they've put on a series of these events throughout the state where they try to connect folks in the community and reporters with local people on the ground, folks who work for cities and counties, just to kind of give an overview of what the state of roads are in other parts of the state. So we decided to go out there, especially since this district was one that is shaping up to be one of the tighter legislative races, and road condition and project concerns were something that a lot of local officials talked about. So it was a bus tour going around Greene County and Iowa County, up in that area, and it was really interesting because both Kriss Marion and Howard Marklein were there on the bus, and I sat right next to Howard Marklein, and we went on a couple-hour tour on a rainy morning.
Yeah, I mean, that's somewhat unusual, the candidates who are running against each other. So Howard Marklein is the incumbent state senator. He was elected 4 years ago, won pretty solidly that year. And Kriss Marion is a farmer, and she runs a bed and breakfast in Blanchardville. So a little unusual, though, that they were on the bus together. Did they interact with each other?
No, not that I saw.
Okay.
I mean, they weren't like fists being thrown up or anything like that.
Right.
It was very cordial, but we were all on a coach bus, and it was a lot of county and local city highway officials, and then folks from the Transportation Development Association, and then Kriss, and then Senator Marklein. So, we were driven around on a series of roads, and then there was a main highway road guy up there in Greene County was explaining everything. So it really was a tour where we were looking at different bridges and different road projects that had gone on, and looking at some of the struggles there. So generally they did not talk, but then there was a part towards the end of the tour, and I was chatting with Howard prior to that, but where they passed the microphone around and gave each one of them an opportunity to talk about, kind of do their little transportation stump speech, and yeah.
So how were the roads?
So it was interesting. I didn't really notice, I guess, that there were a few that were obviously and visibly, not great. And a lot of what we looked at, too, was sort of more about how pointing out to us certain roads that had recently been fixed but had been delayed quite a while because of funding issues, and a lot of the local officials talking about how it ended up costing the municipality much more because of that delay. And that's been a concern we've heard about too, that at the end of the day, money for local road projects, and Walker has talked about increasing that stream, but it hasn't been as high in past years, which has resulted in a lot of delays, and they talked a lot about the problems that created. And also we ended up seeing a lot more issues with bridges as well, and some frustration also with delays there and with a new type of bridge replacement program that the Department of Transportation has put into place. And a lot of feeling actually on both sides of the aisle too, and Senator Marklein talks about this in the clip that we'll play, but with just the idea that DOT should listen more or better to local officials and try to adopt some of the best practices they have too for what their needs are. So some frustration talked about there about just feeling like they don't have great access, they're not really heard, and that some of the policies that DOT puts in place for roads just isn't super efficient. So
okay, well, let's play that clip from Senator Marklein.
Roads are so critical to us. I'm all for efficiency. We need to be as efficient and as effective. And I chatted just for a few minutes before we started the tour with Tom and Craig, and we need to get together, and a lot of these ideas locally need to go up the ladder, to DOT. So hopefully we can get that accomplished here soon. But the other thing, we're going to need more money for our roads, and not just for our roads, but for our rural roads. I certainly wouldn't want to increase gas taxes or registration fees or whatever the additional revenue is, unless I know that it's coming back to southwest Wisconsin, our rural areas. I don't think anybody wants to raise the gas tax and then just have it fund southeast Wisconsin and their mega projects. So I appreciate again everybody putting this tour together, and again, I appreciate the relationship I've had with my highway commissioners.
Yeah, so as you saw, and what we've seen, in the gubernatorial race as well, is just mention of under what circumstances or ways in which he might want to see a gas tax increase. And that's been something that, for folks that say that we need more revenue going to road projects, the big question has been, well, then how do we do that, and should we raise the tax? And so yeah, it was interesting to just, again, an affirmation that if we do raise that tax and we see more revenue coming in, he doesn't want it going to southeast Wisconsin mega projects and wants it really coming to rural roads. So yeah, he also emphasized to me, I was sitting next to him on the bus and had talked to him a little bit prior to him speaking to the rest of the group, but just talked about how he sits on the Transportation Projects Commission as well and has been somewhat, has monitored this issue. And so he talked a lot about just the ways in which he really maintains relationships with all of his local transportation officials and how this is something that really does concern him and is one of his top issues.
Yeah, I mean, on the gas tax, we saw in a recent Marquette poll that 60-some% of people say they don't support raising the gas tax or vehicle registration fees to fund road projects, which leaves you with the question, well, how do you do it then? And we've heard from a lot of candidates on this. We've heard Scott Walker talking about looking for more efficiencies, still holding pretty firm on not raising a gas tax or vehicle registration fees without some sort of corresponding cut somewhere. Tony Evers has been much more broad on this and has said all options are on the table. He's really framing this as an issue where both parties need to come together and talk about it. And I think this is one of those rare issues that does cut across all parties, and you have people on both sides of the aisle who are either very opposed to raising the gas tax or very supportive of it, supportive of a mix of things. It's definitely one of those issues that is probably more regional than it is in party, based on how you feel about it.
Definitely. And I think for me, that's what makes it a compelling issue to some degree, is that it doesn't cut across straight party lines like we see so many things talked about, so many policy issues now.
Yeah.
And I think too, it's really interesting because regardless of who wins the governor's race, there's going to be a change. And if Walker wins re-election, I mean, there's division within the Senate and Assembly caucus about, maybe not so much the Assembly caucus, but in the Senate caucus about what to do about this. And it's going to be, I think, an ongoing point of dispute, especially when we get back into budget issues. So
yeah, absolutely.
That'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Wedge Issues is sponsored by WisPolitics.com. You can become a WisPolitics.com member. Find out more at WisPolitics.com/membership.
So what did Kriss Marion bring to this conversation?
So she I thought had a really interesting perspective. She lives out, in Blanchardville and in a really rural area, and talked a lot about how, firsthand experience being a farmer and trying to just, when she has to commute from where she lives, dealing with poor road conditions, and also, if there's structural issues with bridges, they have to downgrade the weight limit, and then that can at times render a bridge unusable for folks, which then makes your routes worse. And anyway, it's something, that, folks living in the city don't really have to deal with or address, but that is a real thing when you're a farmer, as she talks about trying to get her goods to market. So I thought her perspective was interesting, and she also spoke a lot about how, and she sits on, I believe, the county commissioners, and has firsthand direct experience with this, and had said that even prior to deciding to run, she went to Senator Marklein, who's her representative in the Senate, and had discussed this issue with him, and that this was really a key issue, she had said to me, that really led her to decide to run too, because she just wasn't satisfied with what was going on.
Well, let's hear from her on this.
And I think I've said it before, but town supervisors are my heroes for all you try and get done with the amount of funding you have. It's daunting, and I think that we can't just keep saying the same things over and over again. We need to do something different. I was a citizen showing up at the Capitol asking for more road funding before I decided to run, and this is one of my main priorities. I think you all know that I'm in tourism. I have a bed and breakfast, and I know what it's like to rely on the roads to get my customers here. I'm also a farmer, and I know that it's really difficult to get your goods to market when you're struggling to go around bridges that have changed weight limit wise. So we can't keep bringing the bridges down. So I'm thinking that we need to buckle down, make the hard choices, be brave and bold, acknowledge that we need more funding. I think the most efficient way to take care of our transportation problem is to make a good plan, to budget for that plan, even if it means that we have to index the gas tax. I think we need to fund that budget, and then we need to implement that plan. And I think there's just no other way around it. And like you all, I'm tired of waiting.
So did you see any key contrasts or differences in whether it was just the way they approach it or solutions that they were proposing between Kriss Marion and Howard Marklein? Yes. I mean, I think Kriss Marion was a lot more explicit in, wanting an increase too, and even going back to indexing, which is, I think, even a step beyond that. We could raise the gas tax some rate at some point, and then it could stay at that rate in perpetuity. But indexing would go back to what some say has put us in this dilemma in the first place. So the gas tax would be raised to some certain degree every year. Tied to inflation,
I think, yeah. I think we ended that in 2005 or 2006.
It was a bipartisan decision at the time.
It was, yeah. Voted on by John Gard, who I had interviewed about this when I wrote a story about this a while back, who said he now regrets it. So, yeah, in some people's minds, this is what really has led to our big revenue problem. And so we haven't really heard bringing back indexing, I think, as something that most folks are saying that they would do. But Kriss Marion says that should be on the table, too. So that, I think, was a big departure in just her more explicit affirmation of we need that. So one other clip that I cut out of this bus experience for you today is just a snippet of the tour of some of the roads that we saw. We were in Lafayette County, and Tom Jean, who's the Lafayette County Highway Commissioner, as we drove around, he pointed out a variety of roads. And one of the roads that he pointed out was this state highway that had been fixed by DOT, but that he had just pointed out had taken a while, had ended up happening several years after they originally put in the request, and because of that ended up costing a bunch more. And then he had expressed a little bit of disappointment that some of the sealing, the way that the pavement is sealed on top, was already starting to crack, and the road had just been put in a year later. So this is just an example of some of the things that they showed us on this tour.
When we get into Argyle here, we're going to take 78 and head to the south on State Highway 78. This is a project. There's a bridge involved in this at Cherry Creek that was planned to be done in 2009. We'll be going over top of that bridge. And at that time, we had a public informational meeting. We had a pre-con meeting on it, and then that got moved down the road. At that time, that bridge was going to cost about $150,000. Time we pushed it down the road to where we're at today and got it done last year, the bridge alone was $350,000. This particular stretch of road, like I say, was planned to have something done to it back in 2009, 2010. We just got it done last year. And this is a stretch of road that I'm telling you that, we're glad that it got done. It really needed to be done. But at some point in time, more should have been done to it to make it a better surface on it. It's going to have to be crack filled this fall already, less than a year after it was laid.
Well, it sounds like it was an interesting day out on the roads in the bus. This is absolutely a race that I think is on the radar for anyone who's following the potential for the state Senate to flip to Democratic control. Republicans have an 18-15 majority right now, so Democrats would have to gain a couple seats to do this. This is definitely one that they're targeting. It's an interesting area. It used to be represented by Dale Schultz, who really for most of his career was a pretty solid party line vote, but toward the end of it became known more as a little bit of a maverick or a moderate because he voted against Act 10 and started bucking the party line a little bit after that. So the district has kind of come to be known as a representation of that desire to go back to some sort of moderation. Kriss Marion, I think, is not running as a real far-left Democrat, and I think probably represents a lot of what Democrats are looking for in candidates. But at the same time, you have Howard Marklein, who's got a reputation for being a really hard worker and a solid campaigner. Definitely has the monetary advantage there. So I think a lot of people are paying attention to this race.
Yeah, and I think that's super interesting and is part of what made this bus tour compelling for me to attend.
Yeah, not to plug another publication, but Isthmus actually had a pretty good story on the race. I guess we can just plug another publication. Yeah. they ran a good story on this race. Dave Chislevich followed Kriss Marion around a little bit and wrote a little profile. Was a pretty good insight into the dynamics of the district, as was your trip, which we can. You wrote about this trip, so people can go and read your story from last month when you did this in the first place too. Yep, definitely. Yeah, and I agree. The Isthmus story was super helpful, I think, in introducing Kriss Marion to folks here. And yeah, shortly after I did the tour, I did write a story in print that went over in a little bit more detail some of the issues that they were having and gave some context to this district. So great. Well, thanks for joining me to talk about this.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Just like the girls I like to meet, and since my heart still likes to beat, I'm coming home. Come home with me, Wisconsin.
Thank you for listening to Wedge Issues. Our theme music is Oh Wisconsin by Loxley. We'll be back at the very least every Friday with new episodes, but as we get closer to November 6th, I will probably have a few extras for you along the way. So make sure you're subscribed on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss anything. If you have feedback or suggestions, you can find me on Twitter at Jessie Opie, or you can email me at jopoien@madison.com. Check back in a few days for my conversation with Democratic candidate for governor, Tony Evers. We'll see you Friday.
Wedge Issues has been brought to you by wispolitics.com. There are plenty of benefits to becoming a member. You can go to wispolitics.com/membership to find out more.